The Galactic Marines were a legend throughout the galaxy. An elite force, they had been part of countless planetary invasions, bringing entire civilizations to their knees. Amphibious warfare was their specialty. Their technology was second to none. Their armor was nearly impenetrable, designed to function flawlessly in both land and water, with sensors so advanced that it seemed nothing could hide from them. Enhanced physical abilities made them superior to nearly every species they encountered. In their eyes, they were unbeatable. The Galactic Marines saw themselves as the ultimate warriors, unmatched by any other force in the galaxy. Earth, on the other hand, was a newcomer to the Galactic Coalition. Humans were a small, relatively insignificant species compared to the other member planets. Their military, while respected on Earth, was viewed as primitive by galactic standards. Earth's amphibious troops, especially the Navy SEALs, were scoffed at. The Marines saw their training as outdated, their gear as laughably low-tech, and their physical capabilities as inferior. Humans were fragile, they thought, limited by their weak bodies and their need to rely on ancient tactics. In short, Earth's forces were deemed irrelevant, a relic from the past, unable to keep up with the cutting-edge combat strategies of the modern galaxy. It was during a joint military exercise that the full extent of this condescension became apparent. The Galactic Marines openly mocked Earth's Navy SEALs. The Marines couldn't fathom why Earth had even been invited to participate. Their remarks were cutting and relentless, dripping with disdain as they ridiculed the SEALs' archaic equipment and basic uniforms. To the Marines, it looked like something from a museum, not the gear of an elite military force. "Is this some sort of historical reenactment?" Commander Zarthan sneered, his voice full of derision as he glanced at a SEAL adjusting his scuba gear. "Or are you humans still stuck in the Stone Age?" The Marines burst into laughter. Zarthan, a towering figure with a smug grin, was the ringleader of the ridicule. He had been through hundreds of battles, fought on more planets than most humans had ever heard of, and his record was spotless. In his mind, the idea that Earth soldiers could even dream of competing with the Galactic Marines was absurd. "They still use knives?" Another Marine laughed, pointing to the SEALs' equipment. "I guess they haven't figured out how to upgrade from sharp sticks yet." The SEALs, standing silent, endured the barrage of insults. Their leader, Lieutenant Michael Hayes, showed no reaction. Hayes was a seasoned veteran, with more than 2 decades of service under his belt. His face was weathered, with deep lines that spoke of a lifetime spent in battle. He had led missions in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth, but this was his first time fighting alongside alien forces. Unlike the Galactic Marines, he didn't need enhancements or advanced technology to lead his men. His confidence came from experience, from knowing the capabilities of his team, and from trusting in their training. The Marines' mockery didn't bother him. He'd seen this before, a cocky enemy, too arrogant to realize what they were walking into. He knew how that usually ended. As the Marines continued their taunts, Hayes exchanged a glance with his team. No words were needed. The SEALs had been underestimated before, and they would be again. It didn't matter. They weren't there to prove themselves to the Marines. They were there to do their job, and when the time came, they would. The mockery persisted throughout the day. Zarthan seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting the SEALs, watching their every move with a condescending smirk. His superiority complex was palpable. He couldn't wait to see them fail. For him, it was only a matter of time before they would be humiliated in front of the entire coalition. It was a game to him, one that he was certain he'd win. "They can't even swim like us," Zarthan boasted during a strategy meeting, his gaze fixed on Hayes. "Their planet is mostly water, and they still don't know how to fight in it properly. We'll have to rescue them before they drown." The room filled with laughter again, but Hayes remained stone-faced. Inside, however, a quiet tension was building. The SEALs weren't ones to engage in petty back and forth. Their training had taught them to remain focused, to never rise to provocations. But everyone had their limit, and it was clear that Zarthan was pushing them. Soon, the real test would begin. Word spread quickly that an interspecies war was brewing, and the Galactic Coalition's forces were being called into action. A dangerous amphibious mission was being planned on a hostile planet, a planet where amphibious combat would be the key to victory. The Galactic Marines, naturally, were assigned to lead the assault. But to their surprise, the Navy SEALs were also tapped to join the operation. It wasn't because anyone believed in their ability. Rather, it was a political move, a show of unity within the coalition. The SEALs were there as a symbolic gesture, little more than an afterthought in the grand strategy. When Hayes received the orders, he simply nodded. His team followed without question, ready for whatever lay ahead. For the Marines, however, it was another opportunity to belittle Earth's troops. Zarthan couldn't resist one final jab before the mission briefing. "Just stay out of our way," he said, grinning. "We'll take care of the real fight. You can sit back and watch how it's done." Hayes didn't respond. He didn't need to. His focus was on the mission. The SEALs weren't there to engage in petty rivalries or prove themselves to the Galactic Marines. Their objective was simple: complete the mission and get the job done. And as far as Hayes was concerned, nothing else mattered. As the Marines walked away, still chuckling amongst themselves, Hayes and his team began their preparations in silence. They knew what was coming. They had faced impossible odds before, and this would be no different. In their eyes, the Galactic Marines could mock all they wanted, but soon enough, the battlefield would show who truly belonged there. And when that time came, the SEALs would be ready. The mission began on a planet unlike any the Galactic Marines had faced before. The entire landscape was a tangled mess of swamp and jungle, filled with thick, stagnant water and dense vegetation. It was the kind of environment that would challenge any army, but the Galactic Marines barely gave it a second thought. They had been bred and trained for amphibious warfare, and this swamp seemed like a playground to them. They expected an easy victory, just another notch in their long list of triumphs. From the start, Earth's forces were pushed aside, relegated to a minor supporting role. The Galactic Coalition had made it clear that the Marines would take the lead, and that the Navy SEALs were only there to observe and assist where needed. To the Marines, this was further proof of Earth's insignificance. As the Marines geared up, confident in their superior technology, the SEALs prepared quietly, unnoticed and unacknowledged. The enemy they were up against was cunning, using the planet's treacherous terrain to their advantage. The Marines didn't know much about them, other than that they were highly adaptive and resourceful. None of this seemed to worry Commander Zarthan and his men. They were certain that their advanced tech would compensate for any environmental challenges. Their amphibious armor, designed to operate seamlessly in water and on land, was believed to be impenetrable. Their weapons, tuned to perfection, were meant to cut through anything the enemy could throw at them. Confidence was high. Overconfidence, really? When the first wave of the assault began, the Galactic Marines charged in with typical bravado. Their battle formations were precise, and their technology was flawless, at least, at the outset. The ground forces surged through the water, rifles at the ready, armor gleaming, completely convinced they would make quick work of their opponents. But the enemy wasn't as predictable as the Marines had hoped. As they moved deeper into the swamp, the hostile forces began to reveal themselves in unexpected ways. Ambushes came out of nowhere, as the enemy, completely at home in the swampy terrain, emerged from the dense foliage and struck with brutal efficiency. They moved silently through the water, their guerrilla tactics throwing the Marines off balance. It was clear they had studied the Galactic Marines and knew exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in their advanced armor. Suddenly, the battle was no longer about the Marines charging forward. They found themselves reacting, caught off guard by an opponent that seemed to vanish into the swamp whenever they tried to retaliate. Their armor, supposedly designed to withstand any attack, wasn't holding up. The swamp water was more corrosive than expected, and their weapons began to malfunction. Sensors that had been touted as the pinnacle of modern technology were rendered useless in the thick jungle, unable to distinguish between friend and foe. Commander Zarthan, still blinded by his belief in his force's superiority, refused to acknowledge the shift in momentum. He barked orders, demanding his troops push forward, convinced that brute force and technology would eventually overwhelm the enemy. But the Marines were struggling. Their formation began to falter, and the once unstoppable charge ground to a halt as confusion spread through the ranks. Meanwhile, the Navy SEALs watched the battle unfold. Lieutenant Hayes, ever the calm and focused leader, saw what was happening. He recognized the enemy's tactics immediately. These were methods that humans had used in Earth's own history of warfare. Guerrilla warfare, tactical ambushes, using the terrain to your advantage. None of this was new to Hayes and his team. While the Galactic Marines panicked, the SEALs remained collected, silently analyzing the situation and waiting for the right moment to act. As the chaos deepened, it became clear that the Galactic Marines were losing control of the battlefield. Their overconfidence had left them vulnerable, and their advanced technology had become a crutch that failed them when they needed it most. Every advantage they thought they had was slipping away in the swampy mire, and Zarthan's commands, once so confident, now seemed desperate. In the midst of this confusion, orders came down for the Navy SEALs to engage. The Marines, still too proud to admit their failings, begrudgingly allowed the SEALs to take the lead in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide. Lieutenant Hayes moved with quiet purpose, directing his small team with precision and focus. Unlike the Marines, who had relied too heavily on their gear, the SEALs trusted their instincts, their training, and their ability to adapt to any environment. They had been observing the enemy from the moment the battle began, taking note of their patterns and weaknesses. Now, it was their time to act. Moving swiftly through the swamp, the SEALs employed the kind of tactics that the enemy had used so effectively against the Marines. They blended into the jungle, using the dense foliage for cover, and struck with pinpoint accuracy. Lieutenant Hayes led from the front, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the panic that had gripped the Marines. The SEALs didn't rely on fancy tech or advanced armor to gain the upper hand. They used their knowledge of amphibious combat, their experience in hostile environments, and their ability to think on their feet. Within moments, they had made a significant impact, neutralizing key enemy positions that had been causing the Marines so much trouble. The Galactic Marines, who had spent the entire mission mocking the SEALs and doubting their capabilities, now watched in stunned silence. The humans they had written off as primitive were turning the tide of battle, using methods that seemed impossibly effective given their lack of advanced tech. For the first time, the Marines began to see that perhaps they had underestimated their allies. The SEALs continued to move through the battlefield, dismantling enemy ambushes and regaining control of the swamp. They didn't make a big show of it. There was no need for bravado or boastful displays. They simply got the job done, one precise strike at a time. And as they did, the Galactic Marines, who had been so certain of their superiority, were forced to confront the reality of the situation. Commander Zarthan, watching the SEALs work, couldn't hide his growing frustration. This wasn't how the mission was supposed to go. He had envisioned a swift and easy victory, with the Galactic Marines leading the charge and the SEALs relegated to a mere support role. Instead, his forces were being bailed out by the very soldiers he had spent so much time mocking. As the dust began to settle, it became clear that the Navy SEALs had saved the day. The enemy had been pushed back, their ambushes thwarted, and the swamp once again under the control of the coalition forces. The Marines, while battered and humbled, had managed to avoid total disaster, thanks to the SEALs' intervention. For Lieutenant Hayes and his team, it was just another day at the office. They hadn't come to the planet to prove themselves to the Galactic Marines. They had come to do their job, and that's exactly what they did. No fanfare, no need for recognition, just quiet professionalism and an unwavering commitment to completing the mission. The SEALs moved through the swamp with a quiet efficiency that belied the chaos around them. Years of experience in some of Earth's harshest conditions had prepared them for this moment. The oppressive humidity, the treacherous waters, and the dense jungle that had thrown the Galactic Marines into disarray were no more than a challenge they had faced countless times before. For Lieutenant Hayes and his team, this was just another mission in an unforgiving environment, and they knew how to navigate it better than anyone. Their gear, though mocked by the Marines as primitive, was exactly what they needed. No complicated systems that could fail under the weight of the swamp's murky waters, no high-tech gadgets that became liabilities in the dense foliage. Instead, they relied on the tried-and-true tools of warfare: stealth, precision, and adaptability. Every movement was calculated, every step placed with care. They didn't need to announce their presence with flashy tech. Their effectiveness came from their ability to remain unseen until it was too late for their enemies. Hayes led his team with the calm, unflinching resolve that had earned him the respect of his men time and again. His eyes were constantly scanning the terrain, absorbing every detail. In a matter of minutes, he had mapped out the enemy's likely positions, anticipating where they would strike next. Unlike the Marines, who had relied on overwhelming force, Hayes and his team knew that subtlety was their greatest asset. They didn't need to crush the enemy in a head-on assault. Instead, they would dismantle them piece by piece, exploiting every weakness they could find. The first strike came without warning. The enemy, expecting another brash charge like the one they had fended off from the Marines, never saw it coming. One by one, key outposts were taken down with precision. Improvised explosives planted in the perfect locations caused havoc among the enemy ranks, and silent takedowns eliminated sentries without raising any alarms. The SEALs moved like shadows through the swamp, slipping in and out of enemy territory without leaving a trace. Hayes had instructed his men to move in small teams, each one tasked with specific objectives that would cripple the enemy's ability to respond. It wasn't about overwhelming firepower. It was about hitting the right targets at the right time. Their tactics were simple, but devastatingly effective. Where the Marines had floundered in their reliance on technology, the SEALs thrived on their ability to adapt. They didn't need fancy equipment to read the battlefield. They relied on their instincts, honed by centuries of warfare that had taught them how to survive and thrive in even the most hostile environments. The enemy, so used to facing technologically superior forces, was completely unprepared for this kind of assault. Their reliance on the terrain, which had given them such an advantage over the Marines, was turned against them. The SEALs knew how to use the jungle and swamp to their own advantage, staying hidden, blending in, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The enemy's ranks began to crumble under the pressure, their carefully laid traps and ambushes now being used against them. With every successful strike, the balance of power shifted. What had once seemed like an unwinnable battle for the coalition was now turning in their favor. The SEALs, without needing the praise or recognition, were doing what they had always done, getting the job done. Their progress was measured in enemy positions destroyed, in intelligence gathered, and in the steadily growing desperation among the enemy forces. As the SEALs continued their assault, Commander Zarthan watched from a distance, unable to deny what was happening. For the first time in his career, his forces had been outmatched not by a superior technological force, but by a group of soldiers he had dismissed as primitive. The Navy SEALs, who he had ridiculed only days before, were now leading the charge, succeeding where his Marines had failed. The realization came slowly at first, but it became undeniable as the mission unfolded. Raw power and advanced technology were not enough to win every battle. There were other factors at play. Factors like adaptability, ingenuity, and the ability to thrive in environments where technology fell short. Zarthan wasn't a fool. He knew what he was witnessing, even if it was difficult for him to accept. His pride, so deeply tied to the superiority of the Galactic Marines, took a hit with every success the SEALs achieved. But he was also a soldier, and he could recognize skill when he saw it. Hayes and his team were operating at a level that the Marines, with all their enhancements and gadgets, couldn't match. There was something to be learned from these humans, something that even the greatest army in the galaxy couldn't afford to ignore. The SEALs continued to move through the swamp with surgical precision, crippling the enemy's communication networks and supply lines. Every move was designed to create maximum disruption with minimal exposure. The enemy, now disoriented and panicking, began to make mistakes, and the SEALs were quick to capitalize on every one of them. What had once been a confident and organized resistance was now a scattered, demoralized force, struggling to maintain any semblance of control over the battlefield. Zarthan, watching from his command post, finally gave the order to regroup. The Galactic Marines, humbled by their earlier failures, began to pull back, deferring to the SEALs' leadership. It was an unprecedented move. Never before had Zarthan placed the fate of a mission in the hands of another species, let alone one he had dismissed as inferior. But there was no denying the facts. The SEALs had proven themselves in a way that no amount of arrogance or pride could overshadow. As the Marines regrouped, they watched the SEALs with a new sense of respect. Gone were the sneers and mockery that had filled their conversations earlier. In their place was a quiet acknowledgement of what they had witnessed. These humans, with their primitive gear and archaic tactics, had done what the Marines could not. They had turned the tide of the battle, not with superior firepower or advanced technology, but with skill, strategy, and an unyielding determination to succeed. For Zarthan, the realization was humbling. He had always believed that technology was the key to victory, that the Galactic Marines' superiority came from their enhancements and their advanced weaponry. But Hayes and his team had shown him that there was more to warfare than that. Sometimes, the greatest strength came not from the tools you wielded, but from the mind that wielded them. As the battle raged on, the Galactic Marines began to follow the SEALs' lead. They adapted to the new tactics, learning from the humans how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to think beyond their technology, and how to fight with the kind of ingenuity that only experience could teach. The mission was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like victory was within reach. And as Zarthan looked out over the battlefield, he knew that much of that victory would be owed to the very soldiers he had once ridiculed. The final assault loomed over the horizon, and the tension was palpable. Deep within the heart of the swamp lay the enemy's heavily fortified base, nestled in the dense vegetation and shielded by natural barriers that made direct assault nearly impossible. It was the kind of stronghold that seemed impervious to the Galactic Marines' traditional tactics. Their brute force and overwhelming firepower would be useless in such an environment, where subtlety and precision were required. Commander Zarthan, now fully aware of the limitations that had previously gone unnoticed, stepped back and deferred to the SEALs. There was no more mocking, no more arrogant remarks. This time, the SEALs were in charge. Lieutenant Hayes, ever the strategist, studied the situation with his characteristic calm. His eyes swept over the terrain, noting the enemy's defenses, their patrol patterns, and the layout of the base. He quickly formulated a daring plan, one that no Marine would have considered. The base was impenetrable from the surface, but there was one vulnerability, a network of underwater tunnels that ran beneath the swamp. It was a natural feature of the planet, and though dangerous, it was the key to the mission's success. The SEALs, with their unparalleled amphibious training, were the perfect team to navigate these treacherous waters. The plan was risky, but Hayes knew his men could pull it off. The Galactic Marines listened in silence as Hayes explained the operation. They had never attempted anything like this, relying on their tech to carry them through battles, but the SEALs were prepared for every kind of terrain, especially one as hostile as this. It was an endurance test, both physically and mentally. The tunnels were dark and unstable, with the constant threat of cave-ins or drowning. The SEALs, however, thrived in such conditions. Years of amphibious training had taught them to stay calm in the face of danger, to trust their instincts and each other. The mission began under the cover of night. The SEALs slipped into the murky swamp waters, their movements barely disturbing the surface. Each breath was measured, each stroke deliberate. Their bodies moved through the water like shadows, completely undetected by the enemy above. The Galactic Marines watched from a distance, their usual bravado replaced with quiet respect. They had never seen soldiers operate with such precision and grace in an environment that would have overwhelmed even the most experienced Marine. Navigating the underwater tunnels was grueling. The air was thick, the water cold and suffocating. At every turn, there was a new obstacle, jagged rocks, sudden drops, and the ever-present risk of detection. The enemy knew the tunnels existed, and patrols above ground were alert for any unusual activity. But the SEALs stayed one step ahead. They had studied the enemy's movements, anticipated their responses, and used their knowledge of amphibious warfare to avoid detection. It wasn't about brute force here, it was about patience, endurance, and the ability to adapt. Finally, the SEALs emerged inside the enemy base. The transition from the suffocating darkness of the tunnels to the cramped, narrow corridors of the stronghold was seamless. There was no time to rest, no time to celebrate. They moved quickly and efficiently, neutralizing guards and silent takedowns, placing explosives at key structural points, and gathering intel on the enemy's operations. Every move was calculated, every action purposeful. The SEALs didn't need flashy weapons or advanced tech. They relied on their training and their unwavering focus on the mission at hand. The enemy was caught completely off guard. Their overconfidence in the natural defenses of the swamp had left them vulnerable to an attack they never anticipated. They scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The SEALs were already deep within the base, crippling their command structure and disrupting their ability to mount a coordinated defense. The Galactic Marines, waiting outside the base, received updates from the SEALs, ready to move in when the time was right. The battle reached its climax in the command center. The SEALs, despite the odds, pushed forward in close-quarters combat. The enemy fought fiercely, but the SEALs' adaptability and unrelenting will to survive proved too much. Every corridor was a new challenge, every corner held a new threat, but the SEALs pressed on, determined to finish what they had started. They fought with a tenacity that the enemy simply couldn't match. It wasn't about strength or firepower, it was about survival, and the SEALs were experts in survival. As the SEALs planted the final charges in the command center, the Galactic Marines moved in to provide support. Commander Zarthan, now fully understanding the capabilities of these human soldiers, led his men with a newfound respect for Earth's military. There was no longer any doubt about the SEALs' prowess. The humans had done what no one else could. They had infiltrated the most fortified position on the battlefield, and they had done it without relying on the technology that had failed the Marines. With a final, deafening explosion, the enemy's command center was destroyed. The base, now leaderless and in disarray, collapsed under the weight of the SEALs' relentless assault. The enemy's forces, already weakened by the earlier strikes, crumbled. The battle was won, not through overwhelming power, but through strategy, precision, and pure human ingenuity. As the smoke cleared and the dust settled, the SEALs emerged victorious. The Galactic Marines, watching from the outskirts of the base, were left in awe. They had never seen anything like it, soldiers who, without the benefit of advanced tech or enhancements, had managed to outmaneuver and outfight an enemy that had bested the Marines. It was a humbling experience for Zarthan and his men, but it was also an eye-opening one. Commander Zarthan approached Lieutenant Hayes, his pride set aside. There was no longer any arrogance in his posture, only respect. He offered a formal salute, acknowledging the SEALs not just as allies, but as equals. "You've earned your place here," he said simply, the weight of the admission clear in his voice. "We've all learned something today." Hayes nodded, accepting the gesture without fanfare. For him and his team, it was just another mission, another challenge overcome. They didn't need the recognition, they had done what they came to do, and that was enough. The Galactic Marines, however, would not forget what they had witnessed. They had learned a valuable lesson about the strength of humanity, not in its technology, but in its spirit. As the SEALs packed up their gear and prepared for the next mission, they left behind a battlefield changed not just by their actions, but by the respect they had earned from their once arrogant allies. In a galaxy full of advanced species and powerful forces, it was the humans who had proven that sometimes, the greatest strength came not from technology, but from the will to survive, adapt, and overcome.